So how do you think about who you are in Los Angeles versus who you've been in other places?
That's a really great question. I think part of like the journey that I've been on over the past 3 years is really been about understanding identity and seeing that for a long time, like I had attached like an action to an identity or an identity to an action. And I think that is something that a lot of us do. We literally say, I am this. And so, you know, I guess I think of myself a little bit more nebulously here. Like there's a little like I don't have such a strong identification with I am an athlete or I haven't been an athlete for 3 years. And even when I was, like I think might have been a little bit of a dangerous sort of ego attachment to say I'm a professional athlete. Um, so right now, I think of myself just as in transition, and I'm not sure that that's a transition that comes to an end, but also exploring different aspects of creativity and art and where I want to put my energy and how that's changing me. So there's a little bit less of a I'm so certain of everything, and a little bit more of like I don't really know anything, and let's figure it out day by day. So there's a little bit more. How do I say it? I view myself as a little bit far more relaxed here. I'll just say that.
Yeah. And just generally the vibe of LA and what feels possible in that city versus other cities that you've been in. Does it feel the same? Does it feel different?
Well, one thing I'll say is that there it does feel like the ceiling is higher here, if there is a ceiling at all. I mean, LA is the epicenter of entertainment arts in the world. I mean, it is. It has been for a long time. Um, of course, other cities have that same vibe, but LA is a melting pot that brings all sorts of people together to pursue their dreams, and a lot of that is, a lot of them are creative dreams, right? A lot of that is driven by the idea of fame and wealth and all that, this bullshit that ultimately everybody who gets it finds out doesn't matter, but they got to go on that ride. But because of that, there's an energy here. Everybody seems to be doing something, which is both so beautiful and totally exhausting because there's a lot of bullshit, but then also there's a lot of real shit. And and you meet fascinating, interesting people who are really, really, really trying and succeeding at either changing the world, or making amazing art or films or whatever it is. And when you find the real ones, and you find those really genuine people, you hold on to them. And one thing I will say is I've never, ever, ever had a community like I have here in LA.
And what is that community like?
Um, Predominantly, I'll say the most healing piece of moving here has been men. I've found incredible men, uh, and they've changed everything. And I think this is one of the issues that I'm so passionate about right now in life is really helping men and looking at the issues that we face. We hear so often, oh, there's a crisis of masculinity. I don't know about that. I don't want to call it a crisis. I think there's a recalibration of masculinity taking place. And I do think that until we understand the degree to which men have been impacted by the system we live in and what it teaches us about manhood, masculinity, sexuality, all of those things, until we understand the degree that we've been impacted, we can't we're not going to make a lot of forward progress. So, I participate in a men's group. My entire social circle is based around basically one guy named Kenny Kane, who owns uh, Oak Park CrossFit LA. It was one of the first CrossFit gyms. It's so much more than that now. And if I look back, almost every single person I know here is centered. He's like sort of the center of the wheel. And and through our friendship, he started this men's group called Treehouse and I've been doing it with him now and sort of sit alongside him in facilitation. of some of those groups. I've been doing it for two years now. And so, I mean, this is a long story. All I'm saying is men have changed my life, and having positive, healthy relationships with men that exist outside of activity, but are more based in values, virtues, and alignment of purpose. And we can do totally different things in the world. Those relationships have changed everything for me.
And how does that change the manner in which you're interacting with other men in this instance? And like, what are you sharing that's perhaps different than how you might have interacted with men in your life before you had this experience?
Well, I think for a long time, I had a really tough relationship with my brother growing up, and so in some ways, I think I was really looking for. I've always been looking for brothers, and when you go into climbing, what I found is like climbing, because it's a high intensity activity, uh, creates these bonds very, very quickly. It's almost like trauma bonding in some ways, which, you're just like, holy shit, we could die. Now we're brothers for life. When in actuality, you're brothers so long as, in general, what I noticed is so long as you're both still climbing and you share that core activity. Um, and I always try to be very, very, open and honest with my male friends. I think what's different here, sort of what I hinted at earlier, is that our relationships are surrounded around our purpose, and clearly defining what that purpose is, and clearly defining what the values that purpose requires are, the actions that purpose requires, the relationship that purpose requires, and then creating an accountability net around that, so that our friendships are all about helping each other push towards our purpose now, and always recalibrating around that. So like when we get together, when we get together in official capacity, there's, we're not drinking, it's not at a bar, we're not watching, but that's great. That's a different thing though. We're actually looking at a specific set of tools that we have to say, okay, like, where am I at energetically? Where am I putting my time? How does that align with, the relationships, the actions, the environments that are going to support my growth? And in doing so, you open up and you start to become much, much more vulnerable, because you feel very safe and cared for by other men, and then you're able to share things that we don't get to share in co-ed relationships, or very few co-ed relationships. So there's a container for safety there that becomes really, really helpful, so that when you show up in your relationships, whoever they're with, you're just more grounded, you're more centered, because you have this big safety net of support to fall back on. And that gives you just, it's like, we always talk about it. It's like, the treehouse groups are the practice, right? And then real life is the game. But you're just like, oh shit, I got to go practice more,
Yeah, I've been preparing for this interview, and I think I've spent more time preparing for this interview than I have any interview that I've done in 108 interviews now. I was thinking about, your work as a photographer, a filmmaker, a writer, of course, which we're going to get to in part two of this interview more deeply. But when you're constantly mediating what you're doing, there is an intimacy to that in the relationship that you might be able to have with your own experience through introspection and reflection, or through the intimacy you might have with subjects you're photographing, for example. And at the same time, I think particularly with photography, you have something physically between you and the experience that you're having. So there's some kind of distance. And
Mm-hmm.
how do you think about your capacity to be present with where you are now in life in relation to, who you are and who you have been professionally, and how has that evolved?
Oh man, great question. Thank you for asking it. It's such a great question. I just wrote a little piece about this. So this is also fun. I have a second book coming out in October. So
Oh,
we'll talk
wow.
about both of them. Yeah,
That's
yeah, yeah,
amazing.
yeah,
Cool,
yeah.
man.
And it's a photo book. It's a coffee table book. So and it there's a piece in that. It's really comes from a journal entry um, that talks about this idea of presence. I was playing with it in my head. I'm like, well, wait, is people often talk about photography as this, this active presence. And I actually disagree. I think that's a lovely, it's kind of a trope. And I agreed with it for a long time. But then when I really started thinking about it, I was like, well, actually, was I ever present to any of that? Or was I actually witnessing it? Or was I if at best was I present with the creative act, i.e., like, or I guess what I'm saying is, if I have a camera in front of my face, what I'm actually looking at is not the moment itself. I'm calculating light, I'm calculating composition, I'm calculating motion, movement, serendipity. Yes, I understand conceptually that what before me is beautiful. That's why I'm taking a picture, or interesting, right? But once that camera is there, my brain is doing something entirely different. It's interpreting through a lens, right? That is not a present moment. It's a creative act. It's a flow moment. So you can be in, this is the way, again, I can only speak for myself, but there's a flow, and flow is different than presence. Presence incorporates everything. Presence is a witnessing to the totality of something, and even almost transcends the witnessing concept. Flow, as it relates to photography, is a looking and combining and slipping into making a moment that translates outward, right? So I know some people will go, well, this is not, I just think that's amazing.
I have no idea. I've never
I
seen
have
that one
no
before.
idea what just
Wow.
happened. I got fireworks. The world's telling me I'm saying something right. Um, Flow is often confused with presence. And so, and again, they're close. They're related. But what I realized was, as I've been going through my life and looking back at pictures and seeing what I was, or how I identified, at least, that so much of what I saw, I never witnessed, or so much of what I witnessed, I never saw. And I just wasn't present to it because I was constantly spinning, thinking forward, forward, forward. Okay, how do? And the other thing because I was confusing the two things, I was chasing the calm of the moment of flow and confusing it as like presence, when in fact I just kept speeding up. I kept looking, 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 looking. And sort of the premise of that journal entry in the book is that, like, I had to stop looking in order to finally see, and I'm still learning how to see, um, and that required me, slowing down the travel stuff. I don't need to go, like, I don't need to go climb huge mountains every year. There's so much marvelous shit in my backyard that if I slow myself down enough, I can actually see and feel like, holy, like, this is amazing. Like, this is amazing what exists right here. And there's a Guy Berg's quote. He says, that the point is not, and I'm going to slaughter it, the point is not to show how inventive and creative we can be, but to notice how much we're already a part of. And that's sort of what I've been going through, which I think people find a little weird. The best job in the world. You're chasing you get to go see all this shit. And I'm like, yeah, I got to go chase it, but I never really saw it, you know?
And when you think about climbing specifically, and I'd really like to loop back to what you mentioned about kind of the transient nature at times of brotherhood in these kind of life and death contexts. But another reflection I had while I was preparing for this interview was when you were in these at times truly life and death moments, or where one small movement could have resulted in your death, and constantly having death in your face, whether it was freeze dried bodies on mountains, body parts, whatever the case may be, all the death of people around you that you saw happen during the course of your career. Did that also give you the capacity to have focus and presence in a way that was not possible in other domains of your life, when you had to be that present to what you were doing physically with every breath and footstep?
Yes, I think the proximity of death is a hijack to a more present state of mind, right? There's a laser focus. But again, I think so the short answer to your question is yes. Like, being close to death reminded me in a very not subtle way that there's a finitude to this, and that in that there's a requirement in those actions to be as perfect as possible. Otherwise, the consequence is the end of this incredible experience. Um, and especially in moments of heightened threat or danger, there was absolutely an attention that verges on, complete presence. But again, I wonder, and maybe this is too granular for people, I don't know. I wonder if that's more about flow, right, than it is about presence. I tend to think of presence as something much, much bigger than that. Whereas, these things are very narrow. Don't die. Foot has to land exactly right. Hand has to go in the right place. Move under avalanche. Like, that's a very narrow thing. I think presence is something so much broader. But yes.
Yeah, completely. And when you say hijack, I immediately think of amygdala hijack. And even hearing you describe that, I'm thinking about tunnel vision, dilation of time,
Right.
and just being stuck in that fight, flight, fear,
Yeah.
freeze response. And
Mm-hmm.
you're right, it is completely different. So when you think about, for example, the men's group and this idea of witnessing or being present for what's happening with other people and just listening, what is the power of that? What is the power of just listening to people around you with whom you have an emotionally intimate relationship and being present to what they have to share?
Mm. Well, I mean, for anybody who's ever been in a relationship, I think we all know that listening is actually really hard, um, because our primary driver, simply by living, is to be acknowledged in some ways. And that's that, when you look at like sort of the base level neurobiology, our need to belong means that we survive. And part of belonging is often confused with being acknowledged. Now, being acknowledged is part of that, but it's what I mean. I was sitting there the other night at men's group. We're sitting around the fire and we're just talking. And as I've stepped into a more co-facilitating, I'm not totally but more co-facilitating, I don't share as much in different groups. So my job in those groups has become to listen. And I found myself, noticing frustration about not being able to talk, but also noticing the temperance that's required to be quiet. And I was thinking about exactly this, like, what do I gain from this? Well, I gain perspective. I can listen to the experience of other men, and I can connect, or other people, not just men, because this extends far beyond that. That's why we do the work, because it's not just about men, it's about everybody, how we show up in the world. I can I get perspective, and it allows me to hold on to my reactivity and not bottle it, just hold on to it and allow the experience of somebody else to land with me before I respond, before I react. So what listening does is it fosters thoughtful response versus impulsive reaction. And there's a huge, huge difference. And most conversation in the world is reactive conversation, because we're actually, and a lot of people don't like to hear this. They no, I'm responding. Well, responsiveness takes a little bit more time. It's more mindful, right? And so the conversation that we have, the conversation that we're taught to have, the conversation that we see on TV and in movies is this quickly back and forth, back and forth. So we're actually taught to do that on many different levels. Responding is a much slower thing, right? It doesn't mean you're talking slow and you're talking like Rick Rubin, who I love, but it's this, but that is emblematic of somebody who's probably more responding to the world. And so long answer short, Listening has helped me learn what a response is versus a reaction. And when I respond, I can respond with more intention. I can actually incorporate what the person has said. And in doing so, I can practice intentional, thoughtful empathy, which then becomes compassion as it moves out of me, right? So I can actually, if I take the time to listen, and this is something that I think is really confusing for people, I can then go, let me put myself, and I do this consciously, let me put myself in a position that I can relate to that. And it's not going to be exactly the same, and see what that feels like. If somebody's talking about heartbreak, okay, well, I know what that feels like. So I put myself in the closest situation I've experienced possible, and I engage with those emotions that are coming up. Now, my response then is an act of compassion where I'm holding that space. Even listening to them is an act of compassion, right? Versus, what we often think of as empathy is like, oh, I'm so sensitive to people's emotions, I can't be around it. That's not empathy at all. That's actually, when I hear people go, I'm such an empath, I can't be around that. And that's something you hear all the time in LA. I'm like, okay, but that's not empathy. In fact, it's the opposite of empathy. That's just sensitivity. That's not like I'm so empathetic. No, empathy is the engagement with somebody's uncomfortable or any emotion. It's consciously being with them in it and being willing to do that. Whereas, oh my God, it's too much. I'm too empathetic. That's actually more narcissistic, which is the irony. See what I mean?
Yeah, no, I completely get it. And I'm thinking about how one of the most common ways when people meet each other for the first time, and I notice this, I live in rural Maine now, and I notice this the most when I go back into city land, is the opening of almost all conversations within 30 seconds. It's some version of like, what do you do? Where do you work?
Mm-hmm.
Something like that. And, this is perhaps easier for people who have had an extremely high level of achievement, or maybe it's not. But how do you think about who we are when we're not those points of identification that are so pervasive in our culture? And what happens when we strip those identifiers away? Like these ideas of, you know,
Mm.
I'm Cory, the guy who climbed Everest without oxygen. I'm Cory, the National Geographic photographer. I'm Cory, the author, as we're going to talk about in part two. What happens when we take those things away? And is that an important thing to do?
I think it's potentially, but by the way, these are great questions. These are
Thank
really,
you.
really good, thoughtful questions. So many podcasts, it's like playing the hits. And I love it. I love it when people come at me with thoughtful stuff, um, yeah, it's the meat. Um, so I guess what I'm saying is I'm grateful because this feels like a really, really wonderful use of time. And time is so special. So,
I'm
uh,
grateful to hear that.
yeah, um, our identifiers again are, like they're helpful because they give us a place, sort of a sense of identity. They lock us into the world in meaningful ways, and they give other people a frame of reference. They're also limiting stories because we need to do this. The brain needs to do this. We need to categorize things pretty quickly and pretty simply because we're also trying to figure out, am I interested in this? Does this help me? And those are that not from a manipulative standpoint. That's just the way our brain is functioning. Like, where's my belonging? What is my safety level? Does this interest me? Is this part, is this part of my survival? And that's okay. That's what we're doing. And that doesn't mean that we're using people or anything like that. We're just quickly going through the world and cataloging information. So we use those identifiers in many ways to help us navigate our own use of time, right? And keep ourselves safe. However, I think our culture, because I think a lot of this is related to capitalism in some ways, because it categorizes us pretty quickly in some hierarchical index that tells us where we sit on that chain. I'm not attacking capitalism. I'm just making sort of a guess at one of the reasons why we do that, right? Why we do it so much in our culture. I think the power of taking those things away, which is very hard to do. Like when we go into a conversation, it's really hard. I try all the time to be like, to not ask, what do you do? I really try hard, and it's hard because you're just like, I don't know what to say. When we take that away, we get into sort of the meatier stuff of our shared human experience. Because behind being in finance or being in entertainment or whatever it is, being in retail, being a barista, what is your human experience? That's where all the good stuff is. The reason we use those things is because it helps us it gives us a reference point to jump in potentially, but it also creates a box in which we might never get out of, like. And so for me, trying to get beyond that shit is so important, and yet I understand its value. I think the value of getting beyond it is starting to see people more wholly, more completely, without confining them to our immediate judgment calls that we create around what they say. And we all do that. We're supposed to do that. Like when we say, I'm not a judgmental person, well, you don't know a lot about psychology or basic, sociology or human survival. If you're saying we're all hugely judgmental people. We're supposed to be. But I think once we realize that, and then once we stop asking those questions, we actually start to say, oh, we might have totally different beliefs, but I want to know more. And I think that's really generative.
When you first started being part of a men's group, what was your experience like in terms of knowing whether you could trust the people you were with to share the things that were on your mind, or to be there for them in a trusting, respectful way?
How you mean, like, how did I know it was okay to trust them?
Yeah, I'm just thinking about people out there who might be listening to this, who might seek out something like that, and similar to what we just discussed around, markers of identity or who people are. There are certain contexts in which being really open and sharing who you are could actually be really dangerous. And like there could be
Mm-hmm.
people who are predatory or who are manipulative. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
just go on Netflix, you can find any of a number of documentaries about how this can go sideways. So I guess my question is, how can you enter into a healthy relationship with other people that are not just oriented around the deification of some guru or ideology or set of beliefs versus
Mm-hmm.
mutual respect, sharing, understanding, and cultivating meaningful intimacy?
Well, first of all, I think you bring up something really interesting, the deification of some guru. I tend to avoid cults of personality and people who are selling something. And there's a reason for that. And we can talk more about that. To your question, there isn't a clear answer. I want there to be. We all have pretty good compasses around whether or not something is safe or dangerous, most of us. Now, part of this is that we don't just jump into this group where we're all of a sudden just sharing openly about the stuff that's going on in our relationships. We've all interacted before, and that comes through sort of, I don't want to call it a vetting process because that's not right, but there's sort of the official work that we're doing around the fire every other Monday, or every Monday in my case. And then there's the non-official work, which is every other Sunday. We gather up at this Kenny's house. We go in the sauna. We go in the ice bath. It's just the guys. And this is sort of our casual conversation time. And in those settings, we're allowed, or not allowed, but other people who aren't participating in the groups come. And everybody starts to get a feel for one another. And there have been guys that have come and we're like, there's no vote. It's just clear. We're like, yeah, they're not this group, right? That doesn't mean they're not going to fit great in another group. And it doesn't mean that they shouldn't be a part of a group. It's just like, yeah, they just don't quite feel right. So then you have this basic structure there, which is part of our social hardwiring to figure out who sort of fits in this club, right? It's also, you don't want to be exclusive, but they're just going to be better personality fits. And then what we've noticed is there are people who go in all out right from the beginning, which is not always healthy. And there are people who are holdouts. And over time, and you can pretty much identify it at the beginning of any of these groups. You can be like, that's a holdout. That's a holdout. That might be an overshare. That's me. I'm an overshare. Or I have been in the past. And what happens is there's this temperance that through time everybody starts to even out a little bit. And what the big moment is when the holdout or the holdouts finally break. And when they do, the cohesion of the group tightens. Everybody comes together tighter. And those are the people, the holdouts, the hard nuts, are the ones that tend to have they're more guarded, and they're actually the barometer of how safe it is. Because once they're feeling safe, then everybody else that they're the most astute. They might be the most guarded, but they're also paying attention to the safety. So they're actually a really, really good barometer of how safe a group is.
Got it. You made
I hope that made sense.
Yeah, no, that completely makes sense. I wanted to go back to something you said earlier, because it was almost like a throwaway comment, but I think it's really important to dig in a bit. So you talked briefly about how, fame, power, wealth are things that most people think about as things that will bring them happiness, fulfillment, joy, that it'll, it's like the cheat code. It's going to unlock everything. For the vast majority of people, they're never going to experience the level of fame, success, and power that you have, or success as an artist or an athlete. So could you perhaps speak more about what what you did not get out of those things that people might think they will get out of those things if they achieve them?
Well, this is a point, and again, we can talk about it more when we talk about the book, but I want to make it very clear that we live in a world right now where we categorize people by privilege. And oftentimes that extends into race and gender, sexual orientation. And that conversation has generated a lot of good discussion. But one of the things that I'm very, very clear on, and that I want to say loudly and calmly, is privilege and wellness are not synonymous. Just because you have money, and just because you have power, and just because you have fame, or whatever it happens to be, that does not mean you are happy, healthy, or internally well. And so when we say, well, that's easy for you to say, guy with money or white guy or whatever, what we're doing is we're categorically rejecting their actual emotional experience. That's a really, really important thing to remember. Privilege and health and wellness, not synonymous whatsoever. It's not to what privilege allows you is access to things. And that's a big deal. We shouldn't downplay it, but that's what privilege really does, is allows you access to things, or it safeguards you from other things that, you just don't get impacted by. So it sort of keeps you safe from certain traumas. But what I've learned is that, like, I've been probably the happiest. They've been some hard years, but I've been the happiest, and my life has been the most generative in the past 3 years since I stopped taking photos. I stopped climbing. I stopped being in front of the camera. I just stopped. I stopped because I realized that all of this was actually driving me further away from myself. It was creating a more identifiers, more and more things that I could lean into or run to when the discomfort of my own internal experience was too great, when I couldn't tolerate my emotions, which was true for about 39 years. I couldn't tolerate the emotions that I was feeling. So, and the more I had, the more money I had, the more notoriety I had, well, I could just distract myself from those intolerable emotions, when the intolerable emotions were the roadmap all along. They're pointing me to actual happiness, or actual joy. Let's not say happiness. They're pointing me toward, they're the roadmap, they're the information on how to get to contentment. So when you have all this extraneous shit, fame, wealth, power, whatever, you just lean into it to avoid the actual work that you need to do. And your internal clock is just screaming like, ah, but you're just like, well, I'll just go on another trip, or I'll just lean into my notoriety, and it all happens, truly very subconsciously. Now, again, this is one of those things that, and this is a bit of a spoiler for later on, but it's like, well, the summit doesn't matter. I'll say it differently, because we'll save that for the book. There are a million business people who have made huge businesses will go, I can tell you right now that the box at the top of the ladder is empty. But I can also tell you that you're going to climb the ladder to try to look into the box. There's nothing there, right? So by all means, climb the ladder, look into the box, and understand for yourself that it's not empty. Don't take my advice. And when you get there, you'll remember this. And if you're wise enough, you will either say, there's two options after that. Well, now I'm going to climb the ladder because I like climbing the ladder, or I don't need to climb the ladder at all. And those are two different pathways. Not one is not right or wrong, but everybody who's done it knows the box is empty. But everybody still needs to climb the ladder to look into the box.